The year was 1877. The Arizona Territory did not welcome strangers. It endured them. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a molten sky, where the heat shimmered off the red rocks like a spirit that refused to die. It was a landscape of extremes, brutal, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the fragility of human hope. Dust and memory lived in that country, woven into the very air. It was the kind of land that tested a soul, stripped away the comforts of civilization, and showed a person exactly what they were made of. Into this merciless expanse came Clara Vance. She sat on the buckboard of a creaking wagon, her pale Boston skin already freckled and burned from the long weeks of the journey west. Clara was not a frontierswoman. Not yet. Her hands were still soft, her heart still half tethered to a world of lace curtains, paved streets, and Sunday bells. She had come to the territory to take up a post as a schoolteacher at a new settlement called Fort Ridge, a place the brochures called a beacon of civilization, but which the locals, soldiers, and settlers alike called a fool's dream in a godless desert. But Clara wasn't chasing a dream. She was running from a ghost. She was running from the empty parlor of her childhood home and the memories of a fiancé buried under the cold, wet soil of Massachusetts. This journey was her last chance to start again, to fill the silence of her life. The journey west had been long and hard. She traveled with a small wagon train, a ragtag group of traders, a few hopeful families, and a pair of men who called themselves guides but looked more like gamblers escaping bad debts. Every mile they traveled carried them deeper into a profound silence. The wind grew dry, sucking the moisture from their skin, and the color of the world shifted from green to a stark, blinding palette of red and gold. Even the stars at night seemed different. Here, sharper, colder, as though they could cut right through the dark. On the fourth night, the wagon train made camp in the shadow of the distant mesas. The sun sank behind the rocks, bleeding crimson into the twilight. Clara sat beside the campfire, a journal balanced on her knee. Riding by the flickering light, she watched the flames dance and wrote, "The desert has no mercy, yet it has a strange beauty, like a truth one cannot look at for too long." She didn't feel the eyes watching her. She didn't notice the two riders silhouetted on the ridge above. Still as stone, they came without warning, as raiders often did shadows on horses. Swift and soundless until it was too late. The crack of gunfire tore through the camp like thunder, shattering the quiet. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams rose into the night air. Wagons toppled with the groan of splintering wood. In a heartbeat, the air was thick with smoke, dust, and blind panic. Clara ducked behind a broken wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her breath caught somewhere between a prayer and disbelief. This wasn't the romantic danger of the novels. This was gritty, loud, and terrifying. A hand reached out from the smoke. One of the raiders, his face painted with streaks of ash and ochre, seized her arm. Clara fought. She clawed at him, striking out with a desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. She was not a warrior, but she was a survivor. Yet her strength was fading against his grip. Then, a voice cut through the din. It was a deep voice, calling out not in English, but in the harsh, musical syllables of the Apache tongue. The command was absolute. The man holding Clara froze, released her arm, and stepped back as if burned. From the shadows rode a tall warrior. His black hair was bound in leather, and a necklace of bone rested against his chest. He sat atop a pale gray Mustang that moved through the chaos with the grace of smoke. His eyes were sharp, calm, and dangerous as they met Clara's. She had never seen a man like him. He carried the weight of command without speaking a single word of English. Around him, the other warriors lowered their weapons, murmuring his name like a reverent incantation. Kylo, he dismounted, his moccasins silent in the sand, and walked toward her. Clara shrank back against the wagon wheel. Her bonnet had fallen away, leaving her hair tangled. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She was trembling, stripped of her Boston dignity. But when he stopped before her, she lifted her chin. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. The desert wind blew between them, hot and dry. He said something to her in his own language. A question, perhaps, or a warning. Clara couldn't understand. She only shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't understand. Kylo studied her. He looked at the fear in her eyes, and the defiance beneath it. Please, she whispered. I mean no harm. He turned to the raiders behind him, barked a few sharp words, and the men rode off to gather supplies from the overturned wagons, leaving the woman untouched. He looked back at her, then pointed a long, steady arm toward the desert horizon. His meaning was clear. Go. Clara tried. She pushed herself up from the dirt, desperate to flee. But as she put weight on her left foot, agony shot up her leg. Her ankle throbbed with a violent pulse. She stumbled, gasping. Kylo frowned. He crouched down, his movements fluid, and examined the injury with impersonal efficiency. A sprain, not a break. But in this country, without a horse, a sprain was a death sentence. She could not walk. He stood up and looked at the horizon, then back at her. He hesitated. The logical choice for a warrior in his position was to leave her. She was a burden. She was the enemy. But then, he bent down and lifted her effortlessly into his arms. Clara's breath caught. She stiffened, expecting violence. But his grip was secure, almost careful. He carried her toward his gray Mustang. The scent of him filled her senses: leather, sage, and the deep, clinging smell of wood smoke. As he lifted her onto the horse and mounted behind her, she could feel his heartbeat against her back, steady, strong, echoing against her own ribs. Why are you helping me? She whispered into the dark. The man said nothing. Perhaps he did not know the words in her tongue, or perhaps he wondered the same thing himself. They rode through the night. The moon rose, painting the desert in shades of silver and indigo. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in her ankle dulling into a rhythmic throb that matched the gait of the horse. She was terrified. Yet, for the first time since leaving Massachusetts, she wasn't alone. She was tethered to this stranger, this storm of a man, moving through the vast emptiness. When dawn broke, bleeding gold over the peaks, they reached a hidden valley. It was a secret place, invisible from the plains below, a cluster of stone dwellings carved directly into the cliffs. Smoke rose from small fires, curling into the morning air. As they rode in, dark-eyed children stopped their play to watch in silence. They stared at the pale stranger their leader had brought into their midst. Clara's mind swam between exhaustion and disbelief. She had been told stories of the Apache, stories of bloodlust and savagery. She expected a war camp. Instead, she saw life. She saw women weaving baskets with patterns that told stories older than any book. She saw a community. She was alive. But she was not free. Kalo halted the horse and lowered her down. The women of the tribe approached. They took her inside a low dwelling, their hands surprisingly gentle as they tended to her wound. They spoke little to her, though one of them, an older woman with silver hair, murmured softly in broken English, "Kalo's will. You safe now?" Safe. The word hung in the air, strange and heavy. Safe. Here. Surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her kind. In a land that had tried to kill her. Clara Vance closed her eyes. She was a captive. A guest. A curiosity. But as she drifted into sleep, the scent of leather and smoke still lingering on her skin, she realized the world was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Time in the Hidden Valley did not move like time in the world Clara Vance had left behind. There were no ticking clocks, no church bells marking the hours, no rigid schedules etched in slate. There was only the sun climbing the red cliffs in the morning and slipping behind them at dusk, painting the canyon in bruised shades of violet and gold. For the first few days, Clara was merely a body mending. The women of the tribe tended to her ankle with efficient, silent care, binding it with strips of cloth soaked in cool, pungent herbs. They brought her food, roasted corn, and dried meat. And though they spoke a language she could not understand, their hands were gentle. The fear that had gripped her during the raid began to loosen, replaced by a quiet, observant wonder. She watched them. She watched the rhythm of their lives. So different from the chaos and brutality the settlers at Fort Ridge had described. She saw mothers laughing with their infants, old men sharpening tools by the fire, and young women weaving baskets with patterns as intricate as the stars. These were not the monsters of the frontier tabloids. They were families. They were people living in a fragile harmony with a land that tried to kill anything that wasn't strong enough to survive it. And she watched him. Kylo. He kept his distance. He did not come to the dwelling where she slept. Instead, she saw him from afar, standing on the high ridges that rimmed the valley. He stood like a hawk, motionless and vigilant, watching the horizon, where the blue-coated soldiers patrolled. Even from that distance, Clara felt the weight of his presence. He was the anchor of this place, the storm wall protecting his people from the flood of history threatening to wash them away. By the fifth evening, Clara's ankle could bear her weight again. She tested it, pacing the small circle of the firelight, feeling the ache but also the strength returning. She was standing there, looking up at the vast, uncaring blanket of stars. When she felt him, she didn't hear him approach. He moved with the silence of a shadow, but the air changed. It grew heavier, charged with a sudden, electric tension. She turned. Kalo stood at the edge of the firelight. Up close, he was even more imposing than she remembered. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the dark, unreadable depth of his eyes. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze stripping away her defenses, seeing past the torn dress and the tangled hair. "You walk," he said. His voice was low, rough, with the cadence of a language not his own. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It's better." He nodded once. He did not smile. "Then you go," he said. "Tomorrow, east, to white people." The words hung between them, final and cold. Clara felt a strange pang in her chest. Not relief, as she expected, but a sudden, hollow ache. She looked at the stone walls of the canyon, safe and sheltering. "And if I don't?" she asked. Surprising herself with the boldness of the question, Kalo tilted his head slightly. A flicker of something like amusement, or perhaps curiosity sparking in his dark eyes. "Then desert take you," he said simply. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. The desert nearly did already. For a heartbeat. He said nothing. He stepped closer, invading the polite distance she was used to. He reached out, and for a terrifying, thrilling second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, his hand hovered over her wrist, where a splinter from the wagon wreck had left a jagged red scar. He didn't touch it, but she felt the heat of his hand. A ghost of a caress. "You have fire," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, stated with the certainty of a man who knew the nature of things. Clara looked up at him, breathless. In Boston, she had been called proper, quiet, dutiful. No one had ever accused her of having fire. "I'm just a school teacher," she whispered, retreating into the identity she knew. Kalo looked at her, and the faintest ghost of a smile touched his lips, a crack in the stone. "Then teach the wind," he said. He turned and vanished into the darkness before she could ask him what he meant. But the words stayed with her, circling in her mind like a riddle. Teach the wind. The next morning, he was waiting for her. He had prepared a pony for her, and a small bundle of supplies: water, dried meat, and a piece of woven cloth. A gift, or perhaps a farewell. They rode out of the valley as the sun bled over the horizon. Kalo led the way, guiding her through the labyrinth of canyons and dry riverbeds. They spoke little. The silence between them was not the empty silence of strangers, but a living thing, thick with unspoken questions. Clara watched his back, the way he rode with an effortless grace. Part of the horse, part of the land. When the wooden palisades of Fort Ridge shimmered faintly in the heat haze of the afternoon, Kalo pulled his gray Mustang to a halt. "This is where you stop," he said. Clara looked at the fort. It looked small and ugly against the majesty of the desert, a scar on the earth. She looked back at Kalo. "Thank you," she said. He met her gaze. His expression was guarded, a warrior's mask. But in his eyes, she saw a flicker of genuine concern. He was not looking at a prisoner he was discarding. He was looking at a woman he had saved. And perhaps, a woman he regretted sending back to a world that did not understand fire. "You are brave, white woman," he said softly. "But brave is not always wise." "I know," she replied. He turned his horse without a goodbye. Clara watched him ride away, a silhouette dissolving into the heat and the dust, until he was nothing more than a shadow on the ridge. She turned her pony toward the fort. She was going back to safety. She was going back to her own kind. But as she crossed the threshold of civilization, she felt a coldness settle over her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her return to Fort Ridge was met with shock. The sentries shouted. The gates groaned open, and people spilled out of the buildings, staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. They treated her like a ghost returned from the grave. They touched her arms as if to verify she was solid flesh. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Vance," the commander said, his voice loud and booming, shattering the quiet she had grown accustomed to. "Those savages rarely spare anyone." Clara nodded, saying the proper words of gratitude. She let the doctor examine her ankle. She let the women of the settlement fuss over her tattered dress and sunburned skin. But she felt detached, as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. Savages, they called them. Monsters. Clara remembered the silver-haired woman murmuring safe. She remembered the basket weavers. She remembered Callow's hand hovering over her wrist. But she said nothing. She locked the truth away in her chest, a secret burning like a coal. Her days as a teacher began again. But everything had changed. The schoolhouse was a small shack of raw timber. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of chalk dust and unwashed bodies. Clara stood at the front of the room, teaching the children of farmers and soldiers to read and count. She pointed to maps, traced letters on the slate, and corrected their spelling, but the walls felt too close. The dusty floorboards and the rigid lines of the room felt suffocating compared to the open canopy of the sky she had lived under for a week. She would find herself staring out the open window, her voice trailing off mid-sentence, her eyes drawn inevitably toward the east, toward the red mesas rising like temples in the distance. She tried to bury the memory of him. She tried to drown it in lessons and letters home and the mundane chatter of the settlement. She told herself it was just shock, just gratitude, just the strange bond of survival. But the desert, it seemed, had a way of whispering what the heart refused to admit. At night, lying in her narrow bed in the teacher's quarters, the wind would rattle the window pane. It wasn't just wind anymore. It was a voice. It hissed through the cracks in the wood, carrying the scent of sage and distant smoke. It whispered of a hidden valley and a gray Mustang. It whispered of a man who had looked at a broken schoolteacher. Clara Vance had returned to the world of the living. But a part of her, the part that had learned to breathe the thin, hot air of the high desert, was still out there, waiting on the ridge, listening to the silence. August descended upon the Arizona territory, not as a season, but as a suffocation. The air grew thick and motionless, pressing down on Fort Ridge until the very dust seemed too heavy to rise. The wells ran low, spitting up mud instead of water, and the heat did not break. Even when the moon rose, it was in this stifling stillness that the fever came. It started with a cough dry and rattling, echoing from the barracks to the family cabins. Then came the heat. Not the sun's heat, but a burning from within. Children, whose laughter had been the only bright sound in the grim settlement, began to fall silent. Their skin turned paper dry, their eyes glassy and vacant. The fort walls, built of sturdy timber and pride, were designed to keep out Apache arrows and raiding parties. But they were useless against an enemy that lived in the air. The army doctor, a man named Holloway, who drank too much whiskey to steady his shaking hands, was overwhelmed. He moved from cot to cot, wiping brows with tepid water, muttering curses at the sky. "It's the miasma," he declared, wiping sweat from his own neck. Bad air. Nothing to be done. But the truth was crueler than bad air. The truth was in the empty glass jars on his shelf. The quinine was gone. The supply train from the east was weeks overdue, delayed by storms or raids. No one knew. And without medicine, the fever was winning. Clara Vance stood in the corner of a darkened room, watching a little girl named Anna fight for breath. Anna was 7 years old. She had brought Clara a handful of wilted wildflowers just 2 days before. Now, her small chest heaved with the terrifying, shallow rhythm of a bird trapped in a chimney. Clara dipped a rag in a bowl of water. It was the only thing she could do. Hold on. Sweetheart, she whispered, though her voice trembled. You'll be fine. But when she looked at the doctor, he simply shook his head and turned away. Fear is a powerful thing. It can paralyze a person. But desperation, true. Maternal desperation does something else entirely. It clarifies. It burns away the rules. As Clara watched the life draining from Anna's face, a memory surfaced from the depths of her mind. It was a memory of the hidden valley. She remembered the smell of the dwelling where she had healed, pungent, earthy, sharp. She remembered the silver-haired woman grinding roots into a paste, and the bitter tea that had taken the swelling from her ankle in hours. They have medicine, she thought. They live in this land. They know its secrets. The thought was dangerous. The commander, Colonel Briggs, had made it clear the Apache were savages. To communicate with them was treason. To enter their territory was suicide. You don't go near them. Briggs had roared just yesterday. They are wolves. Miss Vance, they don't save sheep. Clara looked at Anna. She looked at the grieving mother, weeping silently in the corner. Then, she looked out the window toward the red horizon. Let them be wolves, she decided. I am done being a sheep. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't tell a soul. In the blinding glare of the midday sun, while the soldiers dozed in the shade, and the sentries squinted against the glare, Clara packed a saddlebag, water, dried bread, and her conviction. She took a horse from the stables, not asking, just taking, and walked it quietly to the rear supply gate. The guard was distracted, wiping dust from his rifle. He didn't see the schoolteacher slip out into the vast, shimmering emptiness. Once she was clear of the fort's shadow, Clara rode. She rode with a fury she didn't know she possessed. The heat clawed at her throat. The wind stung her eyes with grit. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the safety of the walls. But she kept the image of Anna's face in her mind, an anchor pulling her forward. It took hours to reach the canyon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the red rocks. When she saw the flicker of firelight against the cliffs, she had found them. But finding them and surviving them were two different things. Before she could even call out, the rocks seemed to come alive. 3 warriors materialized from the brush, their bows drawn, the wood creaking with tension. They didn't speak. They just aimed. Clara pulled her horse to a halt. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She raised her empty hands. Please, she choked out, her voice raspy from the dust. I come alone. The warriors didn't lower their weapons. The silence stretched, thin and terrifying. Then, a deep voice cut through the air, a command spoken in the harsh, rhythmic tongue of the Apache. The warrior stepped aside. He emerged from the darkness of the canyon entrance. Kalo. He looked exactly as she remembered, perhaps even more formidable. He wore no shirt, only a vest of leather, and the firelight caught the hard lines of his chest and arms. His long black hair moved in the wind, and his eyes, those dark, the obsidian eyes, locked onto hers with a force that nearly knocked her from the saddle. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate. He stopped by her horse's flank and looked up. His expression was unreadable, not angry, but guarded, wary. You, he said. The word was heavy with disbelief. Why you come back? Clara swallowed hard. She felt small and foolish in the face of his strength. The children, she said, at the fort. The fever has taken them. Kalo's face didn't change. "This is not my trouble. They are dying," Clara said, the tears finally spilling over, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "The doctor has nothing. I remembered. I remembered your people. The plants. The medicine." Kalo studied her. He looked at her trembling hands, her sun-scorched face, the sheer exhaustion radiating from her. "You come to the wolf," he said softly, "to ask for life. I come to the man." Clara whispered, "I am begging you. Please." The fire crackled in the distance. The warriors watched, waiting for his signal. Kalo looked toward the fort, miles away in the darkness, then back at the woman who sat before him. She had defied her own people. She had ridden into enemy land with nothing but hope. He turned to one of the elders who had appeared behind him. He spoke low and fast. The elder nodded and disappeared into a dwelling. Kalo turned back to Clara. "You stay on horse," he ordered. "You do not get down." Minutes later, the elder returned with a leather pouch. Kalo took it. He held it in his hand for a moment, weighing it, before reaching up and offering it to Clara. "Boil," he said. "Drink little. Make fever break." Clara took the pouch. Her fingers brushed his rough skin against smooth, and a jolt went through her, sharper than the heat. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." "Do not thank," Kalo said, his voice hardening. "You ride back now. Night comes. Desert is hungry." Clara nodded, gathering her reins, but she hesitated. "You saved them," she said. Kalo looked at her, and for the first time, the mask slipped. A flicker of something profound, respect, perhaps, or fear for her safety, crossed his face. "You are brave, white woman," he said. "But brave is not always wise." He whistled, and his gray Mustang trotted to his side. He mounted in one fluid motion. "I take you," he said, "to the edge." "You don't have to. I take you." They rode back together under the canopy of stars. They did not speak. There were no words for this, for the strange, fragile truce between a schoolteacher and a warrior, riding through the dark. But the silence between them was not empty. It was alive. It was electric. It was full of questions neither dared to ask, and answers neither was ready to hear. He rode close to her, his presence a shield against the vastness of the night. Every time she glanced at him, he was looking ahead, vigilant, protective. When the lights of Fort Ridge flickered in the distance, Kalo pulled up. "Go," he said. "Do not look back." Clara wanted to say something to tell him that he was wrong about the world, or maybe that she was wrong about hers, but he had already turned his horse. He vanished into the night as quickly as he had appeared, leaving her alone with the pouch of herbs and a heart that was beating far too fast. Clara rode through the gates of the fort just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. She ignored the stunned shouts of the sentries. She rode straight to the doctor's quarters. "It's poison, doctor," Holloway shouted when she showed him the herbs. "Heathen dirt." "It's hope," Clara snapped, pushing past him. She brewed the tea herself. She moved from bed to bed, lifting small, feverish heads, tipping the bitter liquid into parched mouths. She worked until her hands shook and her legs gave out. And then she waited. By noon, the crying stopped. Not the silence of death, but the silence of sleep. Anna's breathing slowed. Her skin, burning hot an hour before, grew cool and damp. The fever broke. One by one, the children came back from the edge. The mothers wept, clutching Clara's hands, calling it a miracle. The soldiers looked at her with awe. But as Clara stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, exhausted and triumphant, she saw Colonel Briggs crossing the parade ground. He didn't look like a man witnessing a miracle. He looked like a man witnessing a crime. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. He looked at the pouch of herbs in her hand, then up at her face. His eyes were cold, suspicious. "You went to them," he said. "It wasn't a question. I went where the medicine was," Clara replied, holding her ground. "You disobeyed a direct order, Miss Vance. You consorted with the enemy. I saved lives. Colonel, you chose a side," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Make sure it's the right one." Briggs walked away, his boots crunching in the dust. Clara watched him go. Then she looked out past the fort walls, toward the red mesas shimmering in the heat. The colonel was right. She had chosen a side. But as the wind brushed her face, carrying the faint, phantom scent of sage and leather, Clara realized with a terrifying clarity that her loyalty no longer belonged to the flag flying above the fort. It belonged to the wind, and to the man who lived within it. Peace in the Arizona Territory was a fragile thing, woven from silence and held together by a breath. For a month, Clara Vance had lived in that silence, walking the wooden planks of Fort Ridge, teaching her lessons, and keeping her eyes turned away from the eastern horizon. But the human heart is a wild thing, and no amount of reason can fence it in. The truce broke on an evening in late September. Clara had just dismissed her pupils when the sound of frantic hooves shattered the quiet. A pony stumbled through the fort gates, carrying a rider who was barely staying upright. It wasn't a warrior. It was a boy, an Apache child, no older than 10, with blood staining his sleeve. Panic rippled through the settlement instantly. "Raider!" someone shouted. Soldiers scrambled for their rifles, surrounding the exhausted pony. The commander's men raised their weapons, aiming at a child who was too weak to lift his head. Clara didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences. She pushed through the crowd, placing her own body between the rifles and the boy. "He's hurt," she cried. "He's just a child." The soldiers hesitated, looking to their officers. Guns remained leveled. The air crackled with the threat of violence. Clara drew herself up, channeling every ounce of Boston steel she had left. "If you harm him," she declared, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry, "I will report it to the governor himself." It was a lie. She had no influence, no connection to the governor. But the bluff worked. The soldiers lowered their weapons just enough for Clara to pull the boy from the saddle. As she cleaned his wound in the safety of the schoolhouse, the boy gripped her wrist and whispered a name she hadn't heard aloud in weeks. "Kalo," he gasped. "Bring you." Her heart stopped. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Clara Vance became a traitor to her race. She saddled 2 horses and slipped out of the gates, smuggling the wounded boy back into the desert that was waiting to swallow them whole. She rode until dawn, until the red mesas rose like temples against the sky. Kylo was waiting. He stood by a small fire, his face unreadable, watching her ride in. "You sent for me," she said, her breath quick from the journey. "You save him." Kalo replied. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. "You ride far for one not of your people." "Maybe I'm not sure who my people are anymore," Clara admitted. This time, Kalo did not send her away. For the next few days, Clara stayed in the hidden valley. She was no longer the captive or the stranger. She was the woman who had saved a son of the tribe. She helped the women grind corn and tended to the sick. The tribe, once wary, began to welcome her. They gave her a name, whispered by the women as they worked beside her. Tai, stoneflower, named for the pale bloom that pushes through the hardest rock and refuses to break. At night, the camp settled into a rhythm that felt ancient and holy. Kalo sat with her by the fire. The barriers of language and culture began to erode in the glow of the embers. He told her of his youth, how he had been taken by soldiers, kept in chains, and how he had escaped to lead his people north. Clara listened, her heart aching at the quiet pain in his voice. "You must hate us," she said softly. Kalo looked into the flames, his profile sharp and proud. "I hate no one," he answered. "Hate is for the weak." But I remember, he reached out, his fingers brushing her hand, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold desert night. "And do you remember me, every hour?" she whispered. But the world outside the canyon was not so gentle. Duty pulled at Clara like a hook. She had to return to the fort before her absence turned from a mystery into a manhunt. She left the valley with a promise to return. But as she rode back toward civilization, the sky turned a blood red at dawn, a warning painted across the heavens. Fort Ridge was in a frenzy when she arrived. Men were loading rifles, saddling horses, and packing ammunition carts. The air smelled of gunpowder and anticipation. Clara found Colonel Briggs by the stables. "We ride at dawn tomorrow," he announced, his eyes gleaming with a hunter's light. "Intel says the Apache are massing in the canyon north of Red Mesa. We'll strike first and end this once and for all." Clara's blood ran cold. He was talking about the valley. He was talking about the women weaving baskets, the children playing in the stream, the boy she had just saved. "You can't attack," she pleaded, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "There are families there. Women, children." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "And how would you know that?" "Miss Vance, I heard it," she stammered. "You don't know what drives them. You don't see how they live." Briggs stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You've got a soft heart, teacher, but you'd best remember who feeds and protects you. Stay out of this, or you'll find yourself out of a job, or worse." That night, Clara lay awake while the wind moaned outside, sounding like the voices of the dying. She saw Kalo's face in the darkness. She saw the stoneflower surviving in the rock. If she did nothing, they would all be slaughtered. Before the sun could rise, Clara made her choice. She packed a small bag and a pistol she barely knew how to use. She slipped past the drowsy guard at the supply gate and spurred her horse into the darkness. Riding hard toward the canyon, she reached the camp just as the morning light hit the red stone. Her horse was foaming, her hair wild. The Apache warriors shouted in alarm as she galloped toward them. Kalo stepped from his lodge, his face a storm of surprise and anger. "You," he shouted. "Why you come back?" "They're coming," Clara gasped, sliding from the saddle. "The soldiers. 100 men. You have to leave now." Chaos erupted. Warriors reached for their bows. Mothers grabbed their babies. But Kalo stood still, staring at her. "Why you risk your life for us?" he demanded. "Because you saved mine," she cried, her voice breaking. Because I can't watch them destroy you. Kalo turned to his people, shouting orders to move north, to take the children and run. Then he turned back to Clara, his eyes fierce. You go with them, he ordered. You be safe. I stay. I fight. No, Clara said. You stay. You die, he growled, grabbing her shoulders. Clara looked him in the eye, her chin trembling, but her soul steady. She was no longer the schoolteacher from Boston. She was the Stoneflower. Then I die beside you, she whispered. For the first time, Clara saw fear in the eyes of the wolf, not for himself, but for her. Stubborn woman, he muttered. But before he could push her away, the first gunshot cracked through the canyon, echoing off the walls like doom itself. The soldiers had arrived. The silence of the canyon did not break, it shattered. The first gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like the crack of doom, followed instantly by the roar of 100 rifles. Colonel Briggs had not come to talk. He had come to erase the valley. Moments ago, a place of morning stillness erupted into a chaotic storm of smoke and screaming lead. Soldiers poured over the ridges, their blue coats stark against the red rock, firing indiscriminately into the camp. But they had made a fatal error. They expected a sleeping enemy. Instead, thanks to the schoolteacher who had ridden through the night, they found a waking nightmare. Kalo's warriors were ready. They lined the ridges, raining arrows and rifle fire down upon the invaders. The air turned acrid with gunpowder. Clara Vance found herself in the center of the inferno. She scrambled for cover behind a boulder as bullets chipped away the stone inches from her face. She was not a soldier. She had no weapon but her will. Yet, she did not hide. She moved from rock to rock, pulling terrified children into the safety of the caves, her dress tearing on the brush, her face streaked with soot. Through the haze of battle, she saw him. Kalo was fighting like a spirit carved from fire and fury, holding the line so his people could retreat. He was a force of nature, moving with a lethal grace. But even a storm can be caught unaware. Clara saw the glint of steel before she saw the man. A soldier had flanked the position, raising his rifle, aiming squarely at Kalo's exposed back. Time seemed to warp, slowing to a terrifying crawl. Kalo didn't see him. Kalo. The scream tore from Clara's throat. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the cost. She simply hurled herself forward, shoving the warrior aside. Just as the rifle flashed, the impact spun her around. A line of fire seared across her arm, knocking her to the dust. For a moment, the world went white. Then, she felt strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. Kalo was there, his eyes wide with a shock that eclipsed the battle raging around them. He looked at the blood staining her sleeve red against the pale fabric. "Fool woman," he growled, his voice shaking with a rage born of terror. "You bleed for me." Clara looked up at him, her vision swimming, but her resolve ironclad. She gripped his arm, leaving a bloody print on his skin. "You saved me once," she whispered, her voice fierce. "It's only fair." The battle raged for another hour, but the surprise had been lost. The Apache fought with the desperation of people defending the last of their world, beaten, bloodied, and realizing they had walked into a trap. The soldiers sounded the retreat. They fell back, leaving the canyon to the smoke and the dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was the silence of survival. Clara sat by the stream, her arm bound in a strip of cloth. Kalo stood nearby, staring at the setting sun, the adrenaline fading into a grim reality. He turned to her, and the look on his face broke her heart. It was the look of a man who knew he could not keep the one thing he wanted. "You should not have come," he said, his voice low and rough. "If I hadn't, you would be dead." She countered. "You defied me," he said, stepping closer. "I told you to go, to be safe." "I am safe," Clara said, standing to meet him. "I am exactly where I belong." Kalo shook his head. "The soldiers will return. They will bring cannons. They will not forgive what you did today. You are a traitor to them now." "I know," she said. "Then go," he urged, though his eyes betrayed him. "Go before the snows close the passes. Forget this place. Forget me." Clara reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the scar on his chest. "And if I don't?" Kalo froze. He looked at the woman who had taught his children, who had healed his sick, and who had just taken a bullet meant for his heart. He looked at the fire in her eyes, a fire he had recognized from the very first night. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of gunpowder. "Then you are no longer a white woman," he whispered. "You are of the desert now." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Defy me again," he breathed, the words sounding like a vow. "And I will never let you go." Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Then, I will never leave." That night, they left the red mesas behind. They vanished into the vast northern wilderness, two shadows slipping between the cracks of the world. Years turned into decades. The war between the settlers and the tribes slowed, then faded into history. Fort Ridge crumbled into ruin, its timber reclaiming by the dust. The names of Colonel Briggs and his soldiers were forgotten, but deep in the Black Range, the wind still whispered a story. One summer evening, a group of traders lost in the high country stumbled upon a camp near a hidden spring. They found an old couple sitting by the fire. The man was tall, his hair struck through with silver, but his back was straight as a lance. Beside him sat a woman with sun-browned skin and eyes that still held a stubborn, youthful spark. The traders asked if they needed help, if they wanted news of the cities in the east. The woman just smiled, resting her hand on the man's arm. "We have everything we need," she said, as the traders rode away, leaving the couple to the peace of the twilight. They realized they had just seen a ghost story made flesh. They had seen the teacher and the wolf, living proof that love is not something found in comfort or safety. It is born of defiance. It is forged in dust, blood, and fire. And when the earth is strong enough to hold it, it lasts forever. And that, friends, is the legend of the wind across Red Mesa. It's a reminder that sometimes the only way to find your true home is to burn the map and follow your heart into the wild. I'm curious, what would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have ridden back to the fort? Or would you have stayed in the canyon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and while you're down there, tell me where you're listening from tonight. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If this story moved you, please leave a like. It helps us keep the campfire burning. Share it with someone who believes in love against all odds. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so you never miss a journey back in time. This is Echoes of the West. Until the next trail, keep your eyes on the horizon. Stay safe.